exposed to view.
Naked to be undisguised.
The Bare Naked Show?
The Bare Naked Show is a show that dares to shed light on soul trauma.
Experiences that are difficult to discuss, but necessary to promote healing. You have to touch it to heal it.
Welcome to the Bare Naked Show with Dr. Simmons and Jae Hers. I am your girl, Dr. Simmons. We're so excited about our show today. This is a continuation of our last episode, and we are looking forward to just an amazing discussion. Again, I'm Dr. Simmons, and my partner is...
Hey, everybody. It's your girl, Jae Hers. Thank you so much for joining us today. Definitely, as Doc said, part 2, we're talking about caught in the middle, African American. Last time you were with us, we had a really good discussion, kind of introed you to what we're talking about. We talked about some of our experiences. We're going to just dive right into part 2. We're going to talk more about life inside and outside. So it's inside out. What was life like being in an African home, some of the things, the experiences around that. And again, as we've always emphasized, we want to touch on things that may harbor certain things that we'll harbor and don't recognize them, that we're actually harboring certain soul traumas. So absolutely looking forward to getting started with this discussion, Doc. Go ahead and take it away.
Yeah. So just to recap, I guess for some, we had some interesting discussions. I remember last episode, we actually had conversations around, some of the name calling that we endured, some of the interesting questions that were raised or, some of the interesting questions that were brought to us or proposed to us, is Tarzan your neighbor, and so forth and so on. And one of the things that we highlighted in that episode is the extent to which that affects your sense of belonging, right? So it's like, okay, when you, number one, there's this whole idea of you truly don't understand what it is to be African for those that are asking those questions. But at the same time, there's also this misconception of what being African is. So we had an interesting conversation around, well, if the people at home don't really, there comes a place in your life as an African American, born in Africa, raised in America, where you are looking for your place in life and your sense of belonging. So one of the things that stuck out to me from last episode is how uniquely different it was growing up in an African household and then also trying to go to school in an American atmosphere. And there are marked differences between the two. So I think for me, I wanted us to kind of go ahead and talk about what life was like, first of all, inside of an African household, right? One of the things that I thought was very interesting is this whole idea of curfew. I remember being in high school, and my friends would complain, right, about having curfew. Oh, my curfew's 9 o'clock. That's so annoying. Or my curfew's 10. That's so ridiculous. And my first thought was, what is curfew? Because you're raised to just know that after school, and for those of us that were athletes, after track practice, you come home and you're on the clock. So your parents are waiting for you. So if you didn't have practice, the idea was that you'd be coming home. If school was over at 2:52, you should be home by 3:08. and so this whole idea of curfew was so foreign to me. So I want to hear your, what was it like for you? Did you have a curfew, or was it this expectation that, listen, when school is over, you need to come home?
I love that you brought out that point because, like you, the concept of curfew. So I had two sides of it, right? Concept of curfew was odd because, like you said, you come home. I was in marching band, or I did theater, musicals. So yeah, it was like you go to school after
Mhm.
school, whatever that time is for the bus ride. You should
Yeah.
be home by such and such and such a time.
Yeah.
And if it's like you have to come home and call and say, okay, we're home. And
Yep.
if they didn't get that call, like a minute later, the house phone is ringing. It's like, oh shoot, like whose turn was it between the siblings? Whose turn was it to call? But then it's funny because my parents became, I would say, more Americanized, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you still had to come straight home, but then we got allowed to, like, if I wanted to go with a friend and we didn't really do a whole lot, and maybe I'm kind of going ahead, but that's when curfew came into play, where it was, of course, we had to know, they had to have the whole fact sheet on who I was going with. Like, they had to know your family before we were even like, who is this person? Who is their family? Uh, but then it's like, okay, well, since it's, say I go with watermelon and cucumber, right?
Mm-hmm.
Watermelon may be more favorable than cucumber. So with watermelon, I could stay out till 8 o'clock. With cucumber, I could stay out till 6 o'clock because cucumber maybe had some unsavory habits or something. So that was curfew. But as far as like what curfew and people, that did not exist. Like, no, you went to school and you came home.
Yeah. It's interesting because you mentioned the term Americanized. So,
I did.
So why don't we talk a little bit about that? Because I thought, that's an interesting term that I find to be prevalent in immigrant households, or in I'll say immigrant households, where it's like you're Americanized. I thought it was just a Liberian thing. And then I thought it was just an African thing. Then I found out from my friends that are from the island, or from, Asia, that there's this whole idea of, oh, you're trying to be Americanized, or you think you're an American. So what is it to be Americanized? What's the concept there?
So for me, and how I use that, the concept is adapting to things that are culturally American, like curfew. That's not something, and maybe other cultures have it, but I like you pointed out, other immigrant household, other immigrant, I have other immigrant friends who are from different, not even from the continent, just other continents, right? In various countries, from Asia, from even some of my European friends, or South American, wherever they're from, or some of the ones, like you said, from the islands. They're just things that are culturally American that you do and or don't do. And that's kind of like, that's like an Americanized way of doing things, or that's an American ideology, or those are American habits. So I think it's like what has become maybe generalized as American culture, if you will. And that culture entails things and habits and, what makes people, refer to it as being American. So like, even the way I'm talking, they will say, oh, you talking like American woman, and I think kind of talking about inside and outside the house. In the home, I was not allowed growing up, and it's funny because I have younger siblings, which didn't have that experience. I find that very interesting. But growing up in the household, I was not allowed to speak like this because I had to have it was them keeping our culture alive and still teaching me and raising me to the values that they hold dear as Liberian parents while they were raising this child in America.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what you pointed to there, two things that stuck out to me is, number one, in terms of being Americanized, one thought was that it's often associated, at least in my household, it was associated with it wasn't neutral. I'll just put it that way. It had a negative undertone, because it meant you were shifting away from your culture of origin. You were trying too hard to adapt to the American culture. And maybe for some household it was neutral, but in our household, there was a sense of like, don't try to be that, be this, and I think in essence, it was my mom's way of making sure that we hung on to our culture of origin and not lose it in pursuit of something else.
Okay.
You highlighted this point of, basically your parents saying things like, don't speak like that. It's so true. Parents, I have found that they become more relaxed as they in their older years, and some of the things that we were definitely not allowed to do, our younger siblings could do. So, we couldn't speak like this, but our younger siblings could speak like that all day long and be okay without any punities, right?
Yes.
What were some other expectations? I guess for me, one expectation was definitely the speaking a particular way. The other thing was just not having the opportunity to talk back, even when you were like convicted in being right. And for me, that was like the thing that really got to my soul, because sometimes you just know that you're right. And in an African household, it really feels as though, so for example, outside, say at school, if you had an argument to make, you could make that argument, right? But in an African household, that argument is stifled. It's like, be quiet, do not say anything, don't you dare talk back to me. And it's like, but, and there's no but. And that was one of my biggest pet peeves, is that expectation of, you're the child, I'm the adult, don't you say a word.
Yeah. I think that I did have that to some extent. And again, like I said, my parents, there was a shifting for me.
Yeah.
And very interestingly for me, I grew up in two households, which were very similar in so many ways. So there wasn't even like an escape to say, okay, when I'm here in this household, I can relax a little bit. And to the point that I have to, even as we're talking, I'm trying to be mindful that we are having a dialogue with a general audience, because my natural inclination when I speak to someone, especially from Liberia or another African country, or even like people from the islands, my brain initially just switches to talking what's comfortable, which is, we'll say our Liberian English, or colloquial, is, it's called now. So in that speaking series,
or colloquial English.
Yes, colloquially, yes. Yeah. So it's an innate thing for me, and I have to be very mindful. Like, oh wait, you can't just like switch and flip. But back to the point of the expectation, I think that parenting, and I feel like maybe that's something is a whole nother subject in and of itself. But that definitely came into play as far as your parents, their word is bond. And again, I saw it play out so much differently with younger siblings. And I'm actually happy, because I feel like there is a sense of finding a balance. We were the experiment. I like to say we're pioneers for a lot of our parents, because they didn't know they themselves were pioneering this experience in this new land. And then you have, that there are these differences, and kind of have whatever the mindset is that we come over here as Africans about this country. Like you said, someone told you streets of gold. Dealing with this and looking at it in a perspective or a way that is just like, whoa, So I would, I definitely dealt with that in the home. Another thing that was interesting in the home was the patriarchy and the gender roles. Culturally, you're a girl, you need to learn how to cook and how to clean and all the domestic things, like to the point where I was just like, I was revolutionary. I was this rebel. I was like, I will not be domesticated. My mom looked at me like, what are you talking about? And I was like, you want me to cook and clean? How come they don't have to cook and clean? Talking about the boys. And she's like, because they're guys. She said something that I guess hindsight is 20/20, which I find to be true. Not to get into that particular part. And she was like, well, because guys if they don't do it, somebody will find it. She's like, but as a woman, that's just going to be your expectation. But it was just so much different. Even though my brothers, they had to learn how to cook and clean, but there was definitely a difference. And it felt almost like the expectation, especially as an older sibling, that was like a whole another thing. The expectation was you needed to know how to run the household. You needed to know how to cook. You needed to know how to clean. You needed to know how to run a house, because you are female. And one day that will be your responsibility. Like, you'll have your own family. So I used to sabotage dinners. Like I was terrible. So thank God for grace. So yeah, I don't know. What was your, did you have a similar experience like that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely the expectation for boys were different for girls. I had a good big sister. There was the expectation that we had to run the household just as girls, know how to cook and clean and so forth and so on. Fortunately, my mom had my younger brother right after we came to the States, and I love babies, so he was glued to my hip, and he basically was my excuse for not doing some things. And my older sister would basically, it was for me, it was books and my younger brother, my baby brother. That's it. Just the two of us. I was either in schoolwork or I was taking care of him. So my mom worked 3 to 11, and oftentimes I would not do any of my chores, and it would be last minute, and I'm running like crazy trying to do things before she came in. But like I said, I had a good big sister because she would take care of most of my work many times, and I didn't have to do much of that. But there was certainly this expectation because the saying was, my mom would always say, "Oh, you think how beautiful will eat?" Like the idea is like, you can be beautiful all you want. That's not gonna get you. That's not gonna get you a man. You need to know how to cook and clean and all this stuff. And then you go out and you hear like, your friends are like, "I don't do that. My mother takes care of this." And I'm like, wow, this is so unfair. There's just a sense of like, I'm putting myself in that mindset now, thinking about how I thought it was so unfair that I had to do all this stuff in the house, and my friends didn't have to do that. They had curfew. They could come in at 10. I had to come right after school, or they didn't have to. Their chore was like clean your room. And I'm like, we got to do dining room, basement, kitchen, all these things. And it still wasn't enough. And they were complaining. And I'm like, life is so unjust.
It was. It really was. I think that's so funny. And even talking about that, I want to kind of segue to we touched on a little bit the African perception of African Americans. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to let you take the lead on that.
That's a setup.
It is.
So, because we're going to circle back to this idea of soul trauma, because this is where it becomes a little bit sensitive,
Absolutely.
I have found that sometimes in many African households that I know, there's this understanding of African Americans as not like, being lazy or, being up to no good. And a lot of times it became problematic with certain friendships, because I noticed very early on that my parents would be okay with me hanging out with like my Asian friends or with my white friends, but like not as okay with me hanging out with my African American friends, right? Because they were like, well, what are they up to? Are you going to Arby's, or are you going to do drugs? And then these are people.
Oh my gosh.
You would think, I remember when pagers came out, and like the only people that had pagers at the time were like my African American friends. And the assumption was like, if you had a pager, you were a drug dealer. And I'm like, no, I just think this is a cool thing. It's technology. I'm totally aging myself right now. But it was like the thing, but the overall expectation or perception rather in the African household, for some reason, and that's a whole nother show, honestly, was that somehow African Americans were drastically different from Africans. And, there was this misconception around, they're lazy, they're drug dealers, they want to live off of the system. And so we're not as okay with you being friends with them. And the one or two that were friends with me, it was like a thorough investigation into their whole life and their families and their backgrounds. So,
wow, that's interesting. And I would say there were similarities, but my parents cautioned us on Americans, period, which I found very interesting, because they were like, if you weren't foreign, being from another African country or West Indies, Asian, they would be like, that was actually the mentality about Americans. that, they have this easy life and they complain, so it was really hard. And I used to always something, why did you bring me here? Like, why am I here? And I remember one time, I will not forget this. I don't know if he even remembers. My dad said to me, you're here for opportunity. When people see opportunity, he said, I want you, if you don't take anything else from me, I had to be maybe 6. He said, I want you to learn. You're not here to whine and complain. You're here to take advantage of opportunities.
Yeah.
And I was just like, 6, what is that? Like, so again, hindsight being 2020, but I think, and I just wanted to bring that out because like you said, circling back to soul trauma, that is a topic in and of itself, but that is a mindset. And then when you come over and you have someone cautioning you, don't get really tight with these people because they're this, and whatever these, stereotypes are. And then you interact with them and they start feeding into several stereotypes. They're the ones, for me, I've shared this, we talked about it last episode. They were the ones that teased me. They were the ones that made fun of me. They were the ones that asked me about, Tarzan. They were the ones that were inquiring. And we said before, knowing the information that they got is almost like on, opposite ends, parallels. We were being taught various things that are totally wrong about each other's groups collectively.
Yeah.
You have people, any group of people, you'll have someone or some things that are just not all the way savory, but it doesn't mean that that's the whole collective. So I think that, and I wanted to point that out because it is something that hopefully that, at some point in another show we will dive into. As you said, it does become sensitive, but this is where soul traumas come from. And I have a girlfriend of mine who told me, had she not met me, she was like, I don't like Africans. She said, I didn't even know that you were African because her perception was all Africans, we are all rude. And I said, some of us are, I said, some of us are very rude amongst other things, but there's a reason why. And I told her, I said, I had to learn to deal with African Americans differently because my initial experiences with African Americans were not good. Like the reality is it was not positive. Not until I was much older in life was I able to understand, knowing the history and, being educated and actually having so now, of course, you see me, you hear me, it's like, oh, she's an African American. And then when I start talking another way, it's just like, oh, okay, maybe not. Right. Mm-hmm. So these are things that, and again, we want to touch on it because we have to touch it to heal it. And I think it helps us to bring understanding, if nothing else, shine that light and shed that light so that we all know and understand that these are things that we have to uncover so we can progress to a place of healing.
Yeah. I appreciate you for sharing that. As you were speaking, I guess I was just thinking about a number of things. Number one, what an interesting way to divide a group of people. Somewhere our parents got the idea that, say African Americans were X, Y, and Z. And somewhere African Americans got the idea that Africans were X, Y, and Z. And
Absolutely.
We all looked the same, but the messaging that we got somewhere down the line caused us to do this to one another, as opposed to coming together as a cohesive unit, And I think that's too deep. I don't even want to get into it. It's just too deep for right now. But that's just an interesting way of just really dividing a group of individuals, And it took us, what you said is so true. It took me becoming an adult, being friends with an African American, for years and years and years, and then having a whole bunch of friends, just multicultural friends. But it took me a while to get to a place where I could undo some of the framework that was laid out for me from my family or just the African community at large. I think one of the things that I realized was, I think for our parents and our aunts and uncles, they were trying to preserve their culture and they wanted us to preserve that culture, but they were also going off of what they were being shown on, like, say, the media. Oftentimes when you see there's a drug deal that happened, who do they show? They show someone like you and I. So they took all of that messaging in and overgeneralized and stereotyped against some people that look just like them. They're just a different version of themselves anyway,
Absolutely.
It's kind of like a weird way to lay the groundwork from some internalized racism, because these are individuals that look like me and I'm, not great towards them. you know,
Absolutely.
and then vice versa. We talked the last time about images that were shown of Africans is with the little, you know, the fly right
bone through the nose,
naked. They never. So
yeah.
of course, that's the foundation that was laid down in our African American brothers and sisters' head about who we are. And I think ultimately, because of the messaging and because of just horrible stereotypes that were laid down, it put those of us that are in this hybrid role in a weird place, because we had to then find ourselves, you know, where do I fit in? Do I want to continue having that mindset of, oh, Americans are no good, or African Americans are all drug dealers and bad people, you know, which is that's just a fallacy, you know, if there's no truth to that, you know, or do I want to educate myself and get to a place where I recognize that these are my brothers and sisters and there's so much I can learn from them and there's so much resilience, you know, and then educate my parents. And, you know, and that's a hard thing to do, because there's this idea of trying to tell them that what you see on TV does not reflect the community at large, you know, and we need to get to a place where we can unite as opposed to divide. But you're stuck in the middle because you're trying to figure out, where do I land and how do I send this message across?
I would say for me, and I appreciate you sharing that. I would say for me, again, this is where even the vast, how we even have differences in how we experience that. I will say for me, I was still older. I would say, I had friends here and there in elementary school, but it was really high school for me. But going to my parents and how they thought, and that again, it was more so like just as Americans. As the more I saw as I grew up, I saw them interact, and I felt like there was a sense of diplomacy that we all came to. And this actually brings me to a place of where I kind of want us to, I know that we're kind of going to wrap up soon, but a question, and we don't have to necessarily answer this right now, but to know where you recognize and realize that you were caught in the middle. Like, when did you realize there was a middle? And how did you even, in something I'd like to kind of put as a part B, we had this conversation, and maybe we'll talk about it later, is where do you find yourself now?
Yeah.
You know, which, are you on a side, or are you embracing that you are a hybrid? And for some of our brothers and sisters, and I think this is not just for Africans, but people of immigrant families and backgrounds, and I will even include African Americans, because now there's this great movement, again, I'll say a resurgence of the Black empowerment and you know, people really wanting to connect with the continent and the cultures that are in the continent, not just West Africa, not just Liberia or Nigeria, which is really popular, or Ghana, which is really popular, but really knowing that there's a huge continent that we all come from, and vastly we all look alike and have so many similarities. So when you come to that point of, when did you recognize, or do you even know that you're caught in the middle?
Yeah. And so I think that's a great place to maybe start the next episode, which is like, at what point did I recognize I was caught in the middle? You know, again, this is such a interesting conversation, interesting dialogue around this. And you know what? I got a couple phone calls after our last show about people sharing their experiences with me. So I do think that this is an important conversation to have, and that it's bringing up some things for some individuals in terms of just trying to find my place, and how did this pooling and this tug of war between two cultures really affect me as a person. And so I think it's a great place for us to pick up next time. When did we realize that we were caught in the middle? Or did we even recognize that we are? Have we, come to that realization yet? It's a wonderful place. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. This has been the Bare Naked Show with Dr. Simmons and Jae Hers. Join us next time when we will continue this conversation about being caught in the middle.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.